We are slaying monsters.
Don't let the ghosts and the ghouls disturb you, darling.
So EJ, when this episode comes out, we are going to be the day before Nosferatu hits theaters.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's pretty cool. You know, I hadn't actually intended to do a series on vampires, but, you know, to coincide with the Nosferatu release, but it just kind of happened that way.
That's so awesome.
Here we are.
Who is it? Is it Bill Skarsgård or Skarsgård?
Skarsgård, I think. You're really putting me on the spot
No,
for
I'm
that one.
sorry,
I think it's Alexander Skarsgård, Bill Skarsgård, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Alexander Skarsgård, yeah, I was right about that one. Bill Skarsgård.
They're
yes.
brothers.
Yeah, and there's a Sarsgaard who's not related.
Pete.
Right.
Pete Sarsgaard?
Could be.
I don't freaking know. Who cares?
don't know.
Anyway, yay, Nosferatu.
Yeah, but I wanted to share a really cool piece of trivia that I learned about Nosferatu during the process of writing up the script for this episode, because I think it's really interesting. So we talked before, Nosferatu was based on Dracula, right? But it was not an authorized adaptation of Dracula.
Right.
It was completely... not bootleg necessarily, but he didn't get the rights to make a movie about Dracula, make a movie based on Dracula. So a whole bunch of stuff was changed, like making the vampire Count Orlok instead of Count Dracula. But ultimately, the original film prints, when they found out about the illegal activity involved in making the film, and you know, not paying the estate of Bram Stoker and all of that stuff, they destroyed the original film prints of Nosferatu. They don't exist. All that we have are secondhand copies of the film prints. The originals are gone.
That's really sad.
Yeah. And the movie was so horrific when it came out that it was banned in Sweden due to excessive horror.
Cool.
It was so scary that they were like, oh, fuck, the public should not be exposed to this movie. We're banning it for excessive horror. Now, the movie came out in 1922. Do you know, you want to take a guess when the ban on Nosferatu was released? And the film was finally able to be screened in Sweden again?
The 40s. 45.
1972.
What?
50 years. For
Wow.
50 years.
I feel like they just forgot. They were like, we better let that. Yeah, we better allow that. That's silly.
I mean, that's possible. They were just like, oh, shit.
They found it in some file. They're like, oh, that's a silly rule. Kind of like the witchcraft thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No,
oh, wow.
Oh, weird.
Witchcraft isn't allowed? That's weird.
So, yeah.
Okay. That's very, very cool. And you're making me want to see the original movie before I see the new one. Because I don't think I've ever seen the original.
You sort of did, because a long time ago, years and years ago, when we had our Halloween party that we invited all the people to, I made a loop of old horror movies that we were playing on the TV, and that was one of them. So, I mean, you didn't actually sit down to watch it, but you saw it loop on the TV.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We are slaying monsters. Hello.
Hello.
Hello there. Hi. Hello. Hi. You there? This thing on? We're slaying monsters. We got Maddie J.
Yo.
And then I'm EJ. And then,
Hey.
What is this? The last episode?
This is the last episode. This is the epic conclusion of the Highgate Vampire.
Ooh.
So yeah, we are going to bring the story home. When we last left our intrepid vampire hunters, they were headed for a battle, a showdown. On one side, you had David Farrant, the Wiccan leader of the British Psychic and Occult Society. On the other, you had Bishop Sean Manchester, an exorcist in training and self-proclaimed vampire hunter. These two were convinced that the Highgate Cemetery in London was plagued by a shadowy vampire who was feeding on the local fox population and just might have turned to people as their next victim.
What do you think? Do you think it's going to be... Do you think who would do the score?
The score of the Highgate Vampire movie?
Yeah, the final showdown, okay?
Okay.
Okay, what do you think? We got Danny Elfman or Bear McCreary.
Oh, it depends on what kind of movie you're making. So my mind...
What's your vibe, though? Like, what's the vibe?
I think I initially went to John Williams. Just
Okay.
for that classic notion. However, I mean, look, I fucking love Bear McCreary. Bear McCreary's like,
Yeah, I know, but it's a silly
Everything.
idea.
It
But
is-
the whole
it's-
thing is silly.
it's goofy. It depends on how much you lean into the goofiness of it.
That's true.
Because I feel like if I can see this being a Tim Burton movie
Me too.
very, very easily. You got well, Johnny Depp is very clearly David Farrant.
Oh, yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
No question. And then who do you have? I think you bring Michael Keaton in.
Oh.
Michael Keaton is Sean Manchester.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And then Elizabeth Wotewu is Helena Bonham Carter.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You got to cast all the
Yeah.
people.
Yeah,
or maybe
exactly.
Winona
Everybody.
Ryder. I don't know. Yeah. But hey.
It could be.
All right. Okay. I'm trying to set the stage here. Okay. So we got Johnny Depp and we got, what's his name?
Michael Keaton.
Michael Keaton.
Yeah.
Sorry. Johnny Depp, Michael Keaton.
Yep.
They're about to face off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can't you just see
Go.
Michael Keaton in
Yeah.
like the long priest robe and he's got the collar, right? And
Easily.
then Johnny Depp is just being Johnny Depp. And
Yeah.
you got the Danny Elfman. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah.
Very good, yes. And that is everybody. That is the height of Matt's musicality. In case you were ever wondering, that's the height of.
That's
all you're gonna get.
That is the best I can possibly. That is literally
It is.
the best I can do.
Yes.
Okay. So these two, they were convinced that Highgate Cemetery in London is this fucking, there's a vampire there. It's living there, it's been drawn there, and it's killing people. All of this is set against the backdrop of Britain's swinging 60s, this psychedelic explosion of pop culture.
Do do do. Do 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 do.
That's why you want Bear McCreary too, because Bear McCreary would totally bring in like that 60s vibe to it. Danny Elfman's just going to do Danny Elfman. Like that's all Danny Elfman has been Danny Elfman for 35 years. Bear McCreary would go and find some like, I don't even know what you would, some super fucking obscure 1960s instrument and teach himself to play it and then have that be like the leading instrument in the score.
Yeah. Best musician ever.
Anyway, these two hunters were destined to meet on Friday the 13th because I mean that date is just the most logical. If you're gonna kill a vampire, Friday the 13th. I mean, if you got to pick a date, why not, right?
My great grandmother, when she gave birth to my grandma, Irish by the way, very superstitious people,
Sure.
I think. Well, they were. She cried.
Oh, because it was on Friday the 13th? Wait, were you born on Friday the 13th?
No, I was actually I think born on a Wednesday, but when my grandma was born, my great grandmother cried. Because she was born on Friday the 13th.
Whoa. So you must have had birthdays on Friday the 13th then.
Yeah, I did.
I didn't realize
I do all
that,
the time, actually.
you know, it's
Every,
actually
7 years?
it's very witchy that you have this lineage of birthdays on the 13th.
Yeah, my grandma, me, and we have the same name.
Are you sure you're not just a reincarnation?
I think I could be. Although we've known each other for many years.
I don't know.
My
I
grandma and I.
saw Hereditary.
Oh, that's
They met
true.
too.
My grandma and I have had a lot in common.
Yeah, you did.
We share a lot of the same psychological issues. Anyway,
So at this battle, right, Farrant, he intends to use his magical rites and rituals that he's learned because he's this Wiccan. Manchester has decided to use the traditional methods, which he has read about in Bram Stoker's Dracula, a book which he considers to be factual. Manchester also blamed Farrant and the other occultists for summoning the vampire with their satanic practices. Now, he believed that he had successfully treated a victim of the Highgate Vampire, This is the poor girl named Elizabeth Wotewa, who had been suffering from fever, neck wounds, and just kind of a general malaise. This is your Helena Bonham Carter.
Right.
So I think it's worth taking a moment here before we get into the violent slaying that is about to happen. I think it's worth taking just a little time and asking the question, is there any evidence for vampire attacks that Sean Manchester claimed to have studied? Is there any proof that vampires are in fact real? The most obvious connection to vampires comes from vampire bats, but these bats were only named in 1810, and that's long after the original Slavic myths were developed. The vampire bats were named for the monsters, not vice versa. It seems more likely that early Romanians were superstitious of bats, especially around corpses. There's an old Romanian belief published in George Abbott's 1903 book, Macedonian Folklore, that a dead person may rise if something jumps or flies over their grave. So bats in particular were thought to have the power to bring the dead back to life, or at least undeath, by flying above them after they were buried. So it was very much like a bad omen if you laid somebody to rest and then you saw bats flying over their grave.
So maybe don't do that in the nighttime.
Don't bury people
Don't
in
bury
the nighttime.
people at night.
I mean,
or at twilight.
probably. But it's not even fresh. It's like if you see bats fly over the grave of somebody who's been dead for a year, that's still a bad omen. It's just flying over the grave at all.
Okay, it's a lot of bad omens.
So it seems the bat connection has its roots in funerary customs, which could explain the obsession with death and coffins that we see surrounding the vampire myth. But what about drinking blood and weakening their victims? Michael Hefferon of Queen's University in Ontario, Canada says, yes. He points to a blood disorder called porphyria as a potential cause of the original myths of vampire victims, and maybe the monsters themselves. He says, porphyria is an inherited blood disorder that causes the body to produce less heme, a critical component of hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells that carry oxygen from the lungs to the body tissues. It seems likely that this disorder is the origin of the vampire myth. In fact, porphyria is sometimes referred to as the vampire disease. Dr. Hefferon identifies several characteristics of the disease that share similarities with our blood-sucking friends. Patients with porphyria develop a sensitivity to sunlight, and their gums recede, exposing more of their teeth, making them maybe look like fangs. Their urine can turn dark red, giving the appearance that they've been drinking blood. And the sulfur content of garlic could exacerbate their anemia, causing them acute pain. While this is a possible explanation, I also think it's wise to be cautious when trying to retrofit modern explanations into folklore. This doesn't explain sleeping in coffins, hypnotic control, the lack of reflection, or the association with bats and wolves. It doesn't explain vampires not being able to cross running water.
Yeah.
And it's such an uncommon condition that it seems unlikely that it would be the root of all vampire mythology. It's not like 10% of the population has this.
Then you could probably argue that. Yeah.
None of these more rational explanations stopped David Farrant or Sean Manchester from their vampire quest. On Friday, October 13th, ITV interviewed Farrant and Manchester outside of Highgate Cemetery. Given the date, many news programs, they're traditionally running spooky stories and they kind of play up the supernatural side. It's just this human interest stuff that the media does, right?
Oh, yeah.
They thought this is a harmless, scary story, but it's about to take a 180 into pure craziness.
Yeah, buckle up, everybody. This gets unbelievable.
Because you get these people on camera, right? And suddenly they have reach. And Sean Manchester claimed to be conducting a vampire hunt that very night. Given the significance of the date, and the fact that, according to him, vampires have to be slain on the Sabbath, I Because, I don't know. I mean, he was just making all kinds of shit up at this point.
That's the beauty of all this.
But it made some kind of sense to him and unfortunately to the viewers as well. ITV ran their human interest spot, talked about dead foxes, the two vampire hunters, and their differing approaches. They played it all for a laugh, right? Mm-hmm. That's why it was such a shock when an army of Highgate residents stormed the cemetery 2 hours later. Unknowingly, Sean Manchester's comment about slaying the vampire that night, coupled with the continual coverage, remember we talked about all the stories that were coming out in the Ham and High, the local newspaper, all of this galvanized the population into action. Hundreds of people, wielding stakes and other weapons, thronged the streets, poised to attack. And I'm not saying that they were all there to attack the vampire. Some of them showed up because they were just curious what was going on. Some of them thought it was funny. But regardless, hundreds of people showed up to Highgate Cemetery because of this vampire.
And I think that just goes to prove that we haven't changed at all.
Right.
This was the 70s, right?
Yeah.
We have been, as a collective, as a species, we've been doing this shit for millennia. Somebody says something, and then everybody gets their pitchforks, and they go. It's very, I don't know, I find it to be very enlightening. It's a unbelievable thing like a vampire.
Right.
In the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
That's
totally unbelievable. It doesn't make any sense.
No.
The police, who were already on alert thanks to this rising hysteria, tried to calm people down. But, I mean, it was basically a torch-wielding mob, like straight out of a horror movie. So these de facto vampire hunters refused to be contained. They charged the gates, they climbed over the fences, and they started tearing through Highgate Cemetery. You're smashing tombs and mausoleums. They spent the night searching unsuccessfully for the vampire. Innocent corpses were dragged from their coffins and beheaded. Some of them were even staked. One skeleton was stolen and taken to Swain's Lane, where it was comically stashed in the driver's seat of a car, as if it was driving the car. That car's owner, John Winter, later commented, "I should have known this would happen if I left my car unlocked."
Amazing.
John, it's not your fault, buddy. Like,
I don't know if this is understated British humor or just the British outlook in general, but that is like such a British thing to say.
It is. It's such a like, oh, well, should have known that would happen. Skeleton shows up in the car.
Yep. Well, time to get down to the pub. Just another day.
He just kind of pushes the skeleton over into the passenger seat, like,
right.
You're riding shotgun today.
Yes. My new friend.
Meanwhile, this night, this siege on Highgate Cemetery, Sean Manchester and a small group of his followers, because he had, he wasn't running a church at the time, but he had been public enough that people respected him and wanted to be part of his vampire hunt. So he and his followers claimed to have tracked the vampire to a catacomb. According to him, he'd followed one of the monster's victims there when she had been under its thrall. This was the mysterious Lucia, the woman who had, you might remember, she turned into a spider before he killed her, allegedly.
Definitely.
Definitely. So they found the entrance to the catacombs unlocked, and they were able to break in through a window on the roof and swarmed around, looked through the area until they found their target, a black coffin. This one, Manchester claimed, contained the vampire because it was made of black wood and looked sinister.
Unbelievable. I can't even with this guy.
It's a good thing the vampire didn't have like a bright pink coffin, or Manchester would be like, no, absolutely not. Not that one. It must be this one.
Nope, we do not kill Barbie coffin.
Yeah. The original, what was it, Barb?
Oh, you mean Barb?
The original Barbenheimer.
Yes.
So Manchester pried the lid open, and he got ready to drive a stake through the heart of this corpse. It was just a dead person in this called poor dead person, somebody's relative.
They just like the color black. That was their big sin. Or they wanted a high quality wooden coffin. Maybe they picked like an exotic wood.
Yeah, it was probably just, and he said it was sinister looking, which probably just means it was fancy. It probably had like some, I don't know, silver trim or something.
Yeah, it was a nice looking coffin.
But luckily, one of his followers stopped him from staking the corpse and pointed out that it's illegal to desecrate a dead body, whether it's a vampire or not.
Wow, there was a reason in his group. Somebody was reasonable.
Yeah. Some
Amazing.
dude was like, whoa, it is illegal to desecrate this corpse. And so I assume he just gave like a really heavy sigh, like, oh, and closed up the lid, and he turned to plan B. Now, plan B was to perform an exorcism, so they sprinkled garlic and holy water around the casket. And that was it. Manchester declared the vampire was vanquished, and they dispersed into the night.
I'm sorry, but if that's all you needed to do, why didn't you just do that from the beginning?
No, you gotta stake it.
You gotta stake it, yeah.
It's really funny because they go through this whole process of like, pry up the lid and get ready to stake it and stuff. You could just like spread some garlic powder and sprinkle some water around all of the caskets.
Problem solved. Just do it all around Highgate Cemetery. And
Yeah, do it around the cemetery itself.
save yourself from all this trouble. Oh my God.
By daybreak, Highgate was a ruined mess. Miraculously, no serious injuries happened that night. Trespassers and vandals were arrested, they were charged. Some even claimed to have seen shadowy figures in the dark, although those were probably other trespassers, not vampires. David Farrant blamed the media for blowing everything out of proportion. Sean Manchester claimed that the frenzy was the vampire's fault and said that its presence was strong enough to provoke fear and panic among the population.
No, I'm pretty sure that was the media.
It was, well, and even as much as I think that you can vilify the media sometimes, I don't even think that's what, they just ran this story thinking it was silly, and then the entire population was like, no, it is a vampire. Or I shouldn't say the entire population. Some of the population said, no, it is a vampire. And the rest of the population was like, haha, this is funny.
Once again, this is an underestimation of the power of suggestion.
For real. Yeah.
You put enough people together and they can do anything.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and all it takes is a small group of people who believe something out of left field, you know, something unusual. Then they collect their little group, Manchester had followers. And then you also have people who show up just to watch the chaos. And amongst all of these things, you get this riot at Highgate Cemetery.
Right.
The Highgate Vampire was here to stay, at least for the moment. Reports continued to pop up from people visiting the cemetery, likely bolstered by their own expectations. We talk about this all the time. If you're looking for a vampire, you go to the cemetery that's supposed to house the vampire. You're probably going to see it, meaning that anything out of the ordinary that you see is going to end up being the vampire. Given its sudden reputation, its popularity, even more legend trippers began traveling there in hopes of catching a glimpse of the vampire. It didn't help that the cemetery was a public park, and the police couldn't really shut it down or set curfews without some type of governmental intervention. Still convinced that evil was afoot, David Farrant and his occultists followed their own trail. In the book Haunted Highgate, which was written by Farrant's wife, Della, the tombs had become a regular spot for magicians to meet and perform their rituals. Someone going by the name Melusine Draco, which is totally their real name, said, "The atmosphere at Highgate Cemetery in the early 1970s was deliciously dark. In those days, there were lots of groups and or individuals using the cemetery, but craft, meaning witchcraft, has its unwritten rule that out of respect you don't work on someone else's patch. We had our secret corners and they had theirs, and never the twain did meet." They actually use the word twain. Never the twain did meet.
Well, they are fancy over there. Also, wow, this is so much like drug corners, how drug corners work.
Oh my God, I didn't think about that, but it totally is, right? It's like, no, this is our turf. This is where we are.
Yeah.
Farrant and his coven soon grew worried about the intentions of these other magical groups in the cemetery. In the Corey Wright mausoleum, they found a triangle and a pentagram scrawled on the floor in chalk. The book Haunted Highgate even includes a photo of these sigils, which look about as quintessentially satanic as you can imagine. Farrant interpreted these symbols as identifiers for Salt, Ouroboros, Mars, and Saturn.
One of these things is not like the other.
Why not? I don't know.
So you have a spice, and then you have some constellations.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Who knows, man?
You know what? It's all made up. It doesn't matter. It doesn't.
Could have been rosemary.
Matters. It could have been. It doesn't matter. Literally doesn't matter.
It's all, and I mean, they don't look like anything. I tried to find any like runes and stuff, but it's all. You just make it all up, man. So Farrant decided that these were left by necromancers, although he doesn't ever indicate why he thinks that. The more you study chaos magic, this Wiccanism and all of this, meaning the more you learn about the people who study it, right, and the people who practice it, the more you realize that most of it is just whatever that person wants to say on that particular day.
It does seem like it's very self-generated.
Yeah.
Like the power is actually in you, and you create the power, and you can kind of like, you can build your parameters how you want.
I mean, that's pretty much what chaos magic is.
That's
those are the
like
rules of chaos magic. Yeah. You know, the inspiration comes from Thelema, which is a somewhat goofy religion started by rich brat Aleister Crowley. The basic idea here is that, kind of what you were saying, your personal will governs everything. That notion led Crowley to have sex with a lot of people because that's what his will wanted.
Hell yeah, man. As long as it's consensual, why the hell not?
I mean, look, Crowley's life is like too strange to get into without taking a huge, gigantic tangent here. Last podcast on the left did an excellent series on Aleister Crowley and all the weird shit that he ended up in. Thelema and his magic, which he spells with a K, have zero influence on the world beyond any post hoc connotations. You can write as many little chalk drawings as you want, but it's not going to alter the outcome of your fate in any way, no matter how strong your will is or how much sex you have.
How dare you?
I mean, and the thing is, it really is post hoc. It's like you say to the universe, I want to get a high-paying job, and then you get a high-paying job, and you say, wow, it's because I willed myself to do so. Well, I mean, kind of, but not really, right? Like, the universe did not listen to you and give you that job. You changed your intentions and put yourself in a situation where you were primed to get that job.
Well, I guess I'm just going to have to go erase all the dicks on my chalkboard now.
You just want dicks?
Yeah, that was my dream. I was trying to bring dicks to me from the universe. Just like drawings and drawings of dicks. That was my mood board. That was the thing. That was like my goal.
Please don't send us dick pics.
You're telling me I can't summon that from the universe?
The real problem is when you realize that there's just an error in translation, and you end up getting pictures of like Richard Nixon, Dick York, Richard Brandt.
Or you get a bunch of wieners getting thrown at your face. Like bratwurst and things.
Crowley, you know, he was ostracized by the general public because he was strange. You know, he was a very unusual person. And he got off on that and played up his weirdness even more and created this sort of never-ending cycle of offensiveness until it became nearly impossible to determine what was real and what was Crowley just saying outlandish shit to get attention. In one famous example, he claimed to sacrifice over 150 children a year because that was the number of times he jerked off.
Yeah. Was he just trying to be funny?
He was just trying to get a rise out of people.
But this was during a time where there was nobody doing things.
No, absolutely not. No. And the thing is, like, Crowley would... He's that person... Like, if Crowley had a YouTube channel... He would be one of those guys who would be doing pranks and then getting banned all the time.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
like that kind of shit. Like, he was just that dude who would say something and progressively become more and more offensive until he pissed you off, and then like love that and feed on it and do it again and again and again. That's just kind of who he was. He wanted to get a rise out of people. He wanted to be the center of this. And then people would tell more and more stories about how awful and evil and satanic he was and all of that stuff. And then he would start to incorporate those stories into his own storytelling about himself, and became this continuing cycle.
I mean, I can't tell if I'd like him or not if he was popped down into 2024. I don't know if he'd be one of those like horrible guys or if he'd be like a fun dude. But
I have
either
no
way,
idea.
I have to say I appreciate the subversion. I appreciate the social upheaval he wanted to do back then. He was probably a dick, but
and there's a whole the subversion. You gotta be really fucking careful with it, man, because like, to a certain extent, that's why we're in some of the political situations that we're in right now.
Yeah, people just saying what they want to say for the sake of saying it and not understanding the damage that they're doing while they're saying it.
Eventually, we're going to talk about the Discordians, and we're going to talk about Thornley, I believe is his name, and essentially what happened with the libertarian movement. I'm already getting too far into the weeds with all of this, but you have to be really careful when you do start these sort of counterculture things, because it's very easy. It's one thing to shake up the way people think and try to get them to think differently. But unfortunately, a lot of the population will think so differently that they'll fly off the handle and go the other direction.
Right. People that are easily suggestible without a basis of reason to fall back on.
And
then you got the dangerous stuff.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, that opens the door for things like Pizzagate and for Joe Rogan, man. And then you end up with these people who are shouting complete inaccuracies, and you've already generated a population that has had distrust sowed into it. And
like the anti-vax movement, which is going to be a huge problem.
Exactly, yeah, and continues to be.
It already is. It's going to get way worse. Anyway.
Precisely. Anyway, David Farrant found these Crowley-esque runes and sigils on the floor of one of these tombs, and he became convinced that necromancers were performing their rituals there, summoning the dead. Believing that this was actually the cause of the vampiric activity in the cemetery, Farrant swore to use his white magic to counteract the evil. After the panic on Friday the 13th, things had calmed down a little bit around Highgate. But on August 1st, 1970, the alleged vampire resurfaced. Now, do you know August 1st as a date of a holiday at all? This is a pretty obscure one.
No, I don't know that.
Okay.
No.
So August 1st is the date of Lammas, or Loaf Mass, an Old English Christian holiday that's celebrated by baking breads, often in the shape of animals or objects.
That is so adorable.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that?
I mean, we can. Just make some bread. I don't know.
It's really cute.
Actually, we don't do it because August 1st is usually really, really hot in Philadelphia.
We don't want bread.
And I don't want to bake bread during a hot day.
Yeah.
It was co-opted from a pagan solstice festival. It's a feast day. Most Christian holy days were co-opted from pagan holidays. Lammas would have celebrated the grain harvest, and it honored the Celtic god Lu. The tradition makes one of the 8 days of the Wiccan Wheel of the Year, along with Samhain, Yule, Osteria, etc. But this Lammas, the only baked bread, was the bread of necromancy, leavened with black magic and kneaded with, I don't know, like evil or something?
Sin.
Leavened with sin. So 2 teenage girls were walking through the cemetery when they came upon a very grisly sight. The dead body of a woman, decayed for at least 100 years. She'd been pulled out of her coffin, dragged out into the path between the mausoleums, and decapitated with a stake through her heart. While this death clearly wasn't the work of a vampire, it meant the vampire was back, or at least legends of it. I mean, of course, right? The stake decapitation's all quintessential vampire lore. Tempers flared on both sides. David Farrant blamed the necromancers for performing black magic again. Sean Manchester blamed Farrant and his Wiccans for raising even more vampires that had to be dispatched. And the police, who thought they had managed to get everything under control after the Friday the 13th riot, had had enough of this shit altogether, and they just lost their temper. 2 weeks later, on the night of August 17th, David Farrant and his coven snuck into the cemetery to conduct a banishing ritual. Again, he thinks it's necromancers, right? He's trying to stop the necromancers. So they drew chalk circles on the ground, they lit candles, and they had an alleged psychic medium chant an invocation. But before they could complete the ritual, they heard voices in the darkness. Not supernatural ones, but human voices. The voices of the police. Panicked, the coven scattered, and the police chased them. David Farrant was arrested, and his possessions were taken as evidence. Among them was a crucifix and a carved piece of wood with a length of white satin cord attached. Now, Farrant claimed that this was a marking gauge used to delineate the protective circles for the ritual. The police believed that it was a stake, the kind that they had found driven through the corpse of the poor woman 2 weeks earlier. And so, Farrant was charged with vampire hunting.
Whoa.
Really. Like, the police charged him with vampire hunting.
Not desecration of a corpse.
Well, he didn't desecrate any corpses, because that was a separate incident.
Okay.
They found the dead body with a stake through it, then they found him in the cemetery with what they said was a stake.
Okay.
So, I mean,
you could argue.
Yeah, but it's like,
anyway.
If you find a dead body that's been stabbed, you can't arrest anybody who has a knife.
Are you sure about that?
I
know, I'm just kidding. But okay, so vampire hunting, that's very funny. Okay.
Yeah.
Weird.
The judge immediately threw it out because obviously it's fucking stupid.
Yeah.
But two things happened because of that arrest. One, the police showed the public that while witchcraft was technically legal in England, the edges of that legality were still blurry. And two, the vampire resurfaced in the news. Sean Manchester jumped on Farrant's story and championed the arrest. He said, the police did a great job. And he called out Farrant, calling Farrant the necromancer. Manchester was convinced that the Wiccans were just fucking things up more. And he started calling his little group of followers the Vampire Research Society.
Ooh. How official sounding.
And he continued his hunt. Now, claiming that their previous exorcisms didn't work, the sprinkling the garlic and the holy water, Manchester decided that he should have followed his initial instinct and dealt with the vampire in the traditional and approved manner. A stake to the heart.
Don't listen to that guy who was reasonable and being like, you're not allowed to do that.
I am almost positive that guy was no longer at the meetings.
Oh, yeah,
At this point, no,
he was
he's
kicked
gone.
out. Yep.
Manchester spent, according to him, the next 4 years hunting down the Highgate Vampire. And in 1974, he was successful, at least according to him. This time, he tracked the vampire to a Gothic mansion in Crouch End, about 2 miles from Highgate. This mansion was a beautiful example of the architecture. It's got spiky arches, windows, dark, almost like yawing appearance. The whole estate was overgrown. It was abandoned. There were vines and trees, like reclaiming this once beautiful mansion. The locals had nicknamed it the House of Dracula, and it stood vacant for several years following a fire. The following account is written up in Sean Manchester's blog and reads like his own version of Dracula, which will make more sense a little later on. Manchester and his followers crept into the mansion one night in early 1974. They found the door hanging open and made a quick search of the burned out remnants before locating the exact same black coffin that Manchester first found in the mausoleum in Highgate.
How did it get there?
He doesn't say.
Okay.
He actually doesn't say.
Magic.
Mm-hmm. Necromancy.
Yep.
Opening the coffin brought the bishop face to face with the monster he'd been seeking. This is a direct quote from his blog. The great leech possessed a sallow, parchment-like skin, beneath which a faint bluish tinge could be discerned, the color of a 3-day-old corpse. It had black hair and eyebrows that were especially heavy and joined across the bridge of an aquiline nose. The mouth betrayed thin, cruel lips, which drew back almost in a snarl to reveal sharp teeth where lodged congealed gouts of discoloring blood, the offal of the previous night's feast.
That's very gross and beautiful. Very good job. Excellent prose, sir. Excellent.
His writing is, I mean, well, just it is so like Victorian inspired and so purple, like purple prose. It's just like, man, he really needed to find his people, and he never did.
I think if you asked him, he'd say he definitely found his people. But
yeah, well,
but you know what? He's the kind of guy who writing novels and writing fiction, all that stuff was never enough for him. Blogs, he could not have just been an author or a writer.
Right.
He needed to actually be out there creating it in real time, living it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like really being that hero in his head. And it's an interesting personality trait, I'll just say.
Hero he is about to become. Because as one of his followers filmed on a 35mm camera, Manchester drove a stake through the vampire's heart. They watched as the monster rotted before their eyes until only a shriveled and decomposed corpse remained. Finally satisfied that the job was done, Manchester declared himself the winner and left. The film, minus a pair of stills, was conveniently lost for decades. Which is probably, honestly, for the best, since some viewers would recall a final scene of Manchester having sex with a woman in a graveyard, like the worst post-credit scene imaginable.
That's a very random addition.
Yeah.
And I keep forgetting, this is a bishop of the Anglican Church, right? Or well, probably not, actually probably not any church.
So, yeah, it depends on who you talk to.
He can't be Roman Catholic, though.
He may never have been ordained.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. That's kind of up in the air, and I don't want to speculate either way, really, because I haven't been able to find any evidence on anything. But allegedly, he was never ordained at all.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Now, we'll come back to the vampire and the film surrounding its death. But first, let's talk about the feud between Farrant and Manchester, who, Manchester, of course, now considers himself the superior vampire hunter because he actually killed the vampire. In 1978, flyers appeared around London announcing a duel between the two of them. Advertising Manchester as a, quote, grandmaster of the occult and Farrant as a, quote, high priest of witchcraft, the duel was slated for Friday, April 13th at Highgate Cemetery.
Whoa, Friday night fight, just like Jake Paul and Mike Tyson.
And just as disappointing.
Oh, he said it. Oh, you tell him, Matty J. You tell him.
Hot take. I don't think that Sean Manchester wore $1 million shorts, though.
No.
According to the overwrought script, this would be a duel to the death by, quote, Britain's most infamous magicians. It never happened, and it was likely a stunt pulled either by a local newspaper or a local citizen for a laugh. As a side note, it's often erroneously reported as happening in 1973, but the actual flyer lists it as 1978. In 1985, Manchester published an account of his successful vampire hunt entitled The Highgate Vampire. Farrant published his own account in 1991 in Beyond the Highgate Vampire. By this point, Farrant had become insistent that he'd never actually called the thing a vampire or been hunting one. He'd simply been trying to track down the origin of a malicious entity that he thought local black magicians were summoning. He started blaming the Hammer horror films for the connection, and honestly stopped mentioning Sean Manchester at all. Manchester reprinted his book, The Highgate Vampire, in 1991, immediately after Farrant published his. But in this new edition, Manchester omitted some of the most important and salient photographs, including the bite marks on Elizabeth Wotewa's throat. In 2000, Manchester published another book, this one a fanfiction sequel to Dracula titled Carmel. It's out of print, which is a shame because I can only imagine what a mess of gothic tropes and rehashed vampire plot hooks that must have been.
Must have been fun.
So I've read a bunch of Manchester's various blogs, like a lot of blogs. And I can say that he writes like somebody who just loves Victorian language. He's one of those. Is there a word for that person who's like obsessed with Victorian culture?
I don't know. The only thing I can think is like a steampunk person, but that's a little different.
not quite that.
Yeah.
Not quite.
I don't really know. I don't really know. But I understand. I mean, I can see why if all you read are things of that time.
For sure, yeah.
Those are the things you're absorbing. Mm-hmm. You're going to put out that kind of thing.
Right.
Like you kind of are what you read.
Definitely,
so,
yeah. And I mean, that's what he consumed. And yeah, he definitely, he would not have read anything more progressive than that because he believed that they were full of sin. You know?
Okay.
I just feel like there's this other reality. There's like a separate timeline where Sean Manchester found like LARPing. And it is spent the 80s and 90s going to Ren fairs as some like exorcist bishop type character.
That would have been a healthy outlet.
Yeah.
You know, like you can live it there in a controlled, safe environment and then write your stuff.
Yeah, and then who knows, man? Maybe he would have been published. Maybe he would have like been the predecessor to Stephanie Meyer.
Hey, one can dream, right?
Around the mid-2000s, researcher Don Ecker started looking into the Highgate Vampire. He quickly found that the alleged victim, Elizabeth Wotewa, was the girlfriend of one of Manchester's friends. We talked about that before. Inquiring after the second victim, the were-spider, known only as Lucia, he found an interview with David Farrant, which named her Jacqueline Cooper instead. And we already discussed how Cooper was named in Manchester's divorce proceedings and how he was likely having an affair with her. The other thing Ecker discovered was that Sean Manchester had produced a film in 1970 called The Vampire Exhumed. Allegedly, the poster for the film showed Manchester, playing the vampire, crouched over a victim played by Jacqueline Cooper. The poster, if it existed, has now been completely lost to time. But an interview with David Farrant shed some light on it for Ecker. Apparently, in the film, Manchester played both the vampire and the vampire hunter. The action ends with the vampire him being staked by Hunter him, and the vampire then decays through a clever film trick. While wearing special makeup made from a watery flour mixture, he sat with a fan and a heater just out of the shot. The hot air melted the makeup and revealed his actual face. And then that clip was played in reverse to give the impression that his normal face was dissolving into a decayed state.
Very cool.
It was great, you know?
Clever.
Like, yeah. When you look at the admittedly poor quality photo of the alleged vampire on Manchester's blogs, it's pretty clear that that person is Manchester in makeup.
Wow. I feel like he was saying something very deep when he did that. You know, he was the hunter, he was the vampire. I feel like when you have to kill a vampire, are you not also killing part of yourself?
I feel like he was saying that his budget was not high enough to hire 2 actors.
I don't know what you're talking about. This is depth. This is an auteur we are talking about here, okay?
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, this is a producer that's like, yeah, sorry, we don't have a budget for that.
Listen, as a scrappy content creator myself in my 20s, man, I totally get that.
Yeah, right?
I was like, what can I do? How many hats can I wear here? How many fangs can I wear?
Allegedly, the film ends with Manchester, the winning hunter, having sex with Cooper in the cemetery. which actually corroborates with the account of the strange sex scene at the end of the documentary. Ecker's contacts also investigated the Great Northern Cemetery, where Lucia was allegedly buried, and surprise, surprise, no one named Lucia is buried there. The entire vampire film now feels like a Tommy Wiseau piece, and I'm really sad it's not available. I think we should petition Manchester to release it.
Yeah, man. That would be really great.
It's an important part of vampire hunting history.
It is.
And so, that aside, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, the story that he was telling later on was just a rehash of the film that he created. Mm-hmm. Because the events go, he made the film, mm-hmm. right? Playing himself, playing the vampire hunter, all of these things. Then he went public with the story in his book, The Highgate Vampire. And that was published in 1985. So he reworked his entire film, pulled the film off the market if it was ever there to begin with, and then wrote about it as if it was factually true mm-hmm. in a book in 1985. David Farrant continued to be an outspoken detractor of Sean Manchester for the rest of his life. He created a comic called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, which ran a few scathing strips about a terrible bishop with a terrible congregation.
Wow.
He also published a blog, davidfarrant.com, which chronicled his paranormal investigations, Highgate Vampire and beyond. Mm-hmm. Manchester, for his part, continued to get in fights with anybody who refuted him and will probably send us angry emails. He runs multiple blogs in various stages of inactivity, with topics ranging from his continuing feud with Farrant to his occultists and random sermons. In 2016, the vampire-themed blog Vamped released an extensively researched post regarding the claims made in Manchester's blogs. The author found a host of inaccuracies. The tomb Lucia identified was incorrectly named. The window on the roof was not big enough for them to climb through. Various other descriptions and spatial relationships that just straight up don't match. Huh. Manchester's heroic vampire slaying, it seems, was completely made up.
Well, that's kind of good, because he shouldn't have been in that mausoleum about to stab a dead body anyway.
He really shouldn't have. Also, like, that's breaking and entering and shit. Like, it's super bad.
It's good that didn't really happen, probably. It's very good.
On April 8th, 2019, David Farrant died. The Ham and High ran an obituary on him, quoting his wife, Della. People imagine him as a man with a stake and a crucifix. And although an awful lot was written about him over the years, behind that, he was a very kind, loving, and somewhat shy man. He didn't deserve the flack he got. He recognized we all do silly things.
I like that.
2 days later, Sean Manchester published his own surprisingly heartfelt obituary to Farrant on his blog. I first came into contact with David Farrant at a time when his fortunes were in a downward spiral, and he took solace in things other than the exotic birds and social drinking in local pubs, which had hitherto preoccupied him. Things did not improve for him when he became drawn to all manner of antics to hold attention of both public and media. What made matters worse was the support and approval given to him by individuals immersed in all sorts of punitive paranormalism and pagan propaganda. They used him to further their own agenda. None really knew him, certainly not as I did. I had insight into the real person from early on. Later, he became more guarded, suspicious, and paranoid, but I knew the genuine David Farrant when his guard was down. He was open and honest with me, and I came to like aspects of him, especially his apparent vulnerability, invariably accompanied by soft manner. I made several attempts in the new century to resolve our differences in person. Nothing came of it. Perhaps I did not try hard enough. I am enormously saddened that he went to his grave without knowing he had my forgiveness.
Oh, that's really sweet.
Yeah. In the end, despite all of their differences, despite their public feuds and all of that stuff, I think Manchester found something of a camaraderie and kinship in Farrant. Mm-hmm. You know, they were both outsiders, for
Yeah.
sure. You know, they didn't quite fit in with the regular British spectrum. And certainly not, you know, we talked about, I keep using the word shagadelic from Austin Powers, but that this revolution of culture that was going on, you know, they weren't really in that. Yeah, Farrant was so occultish and so into this weird kind of esoteric black magic stuff. He would call it white magic, but magic in general. You know, so he was sort of off-centered himself. And then certainly Manchester was off-centered because he believed that all of that was a sin. And I think that it's funny how you see the bond happen, even though the way they went about basically everything in their life was completely different.
They were two sides of a very old coin.
Very old coin, yes. So this closes the feud between the vampire hunters, but leaves a great big glowing question. Was there ever a vampire in Highgate Cemetery? What do you think, EJ?
I would think absolutely yes.
Well, the answer is yes, but not the way you might think it is.
Okay.
In 1969, the same year the first reports began, a blood-soaked vampire did indeed stalk through Highgate Cemetery. As cameras rolled, Christopher Lee reluctantly reprised his role as Dracula in Hammer's fifth film in the franchise, Tasted the Blood of Dracula.
Great title.
By this point, Lee was feeling kind of burned out in the role, but Warner Brothers wasn't interested in a vampire film without Lee as the vampire. So in order to appease their distributor, Hammer convinced him to don the cape and fangs again. Variety, in their review, wrote that, quote, Christopher Lee can now play Dracula in his sleep, and in this pic, looks occasionally as if he is doing so.
Yeah. Christopher Lee is the kind of guy, he is such a badass.
He's a wonderful person.
Such a crazy life, so many accomplishments. Of course he's going to be bored to death having to do this again.
The fifth time. Now. Also, Christopher Lee's Dracula is fantastic. It's such a good character. But I understand that you don't want to make your entire career that.
Yeah.
The film was considered extremely mid at the time, which is kind of what you would expect from fifth in the series. Yeah. You know, it's just not going to get critical acclaim, right? Yeah. But for our purposes, Taste the Blood of Dracula was the most important in the entire series. Because in that film, Dracula resided in a converted mausoleum in Highgate Cemetery. For the first time, vampires were linked to one of London's Magnificent Seven. It put the bloodsuckers squarely in the public consciousness, in a crumbling cemetery, at a time when cultural concerns over witchcraft and occultism were at a crescendo. Remember, this was just after the repeal of the witchcraft laws and during the 60s revolution. This is an upheaval era when older conservative views are giving way to psychedelic thinking. Many of the old guard, like our friend Bishop Sean Manchester, see the world slipping away into chaos, tampering with evil forces that had been kept in check by laws and common decency for decades. No wonder this was being pinned on Christopher Lee.
Oh, yeah.
Lee's Dracula was not only evil, he was seductive, too. He used powerful hypnotism to bring people, usually women, under his thrall. The film features close-up shots of his eyes as he manipulates and twists the minds of his victims. This imagery, the focus on the eyes during periods of hypnotism, will be echoed by witnesses of the alleged Highgate Vampire and even David Farrant himself. Remember, Farrant said, "I saw its face and 2 points of intense red light. The area turned cold, as if I'd stepped into a refrigerator. The figure seemed to be draining me of energy, and I felt I was losing control of my normal faculties. It felt like a vivid dream, like I wanted to wake up, but I couldn't." Straight out of Hammer's Dracula franchise. Or what about the seduction of young maidens, drawing them to him? In Taste the Blood of Dracula, the Count takes two women under his spell, Alice and Lucy. Hypnotized and helpless, Alice kills her father, and Lucy becomes Dracula's bride, stolen away from her righteous fiancé. I mean, now that's straight out of common Dracula lore, but it's also Sean Manchester's story. The women under the monster's thrall, fleeing their decent life to become brides of a king vampire. Remember, that's what Manchester called it, the king vampire. It's the same story told and retold, but suddenly accepted as fact instead of Hollywood fiction. And isn't this just a perfect representation of the cultural conflict at the time? British women throwing off the yoke of familiar gender roles in the name of shagadelic free love. Reject your traditional values, explore yourself. Compare that to Victorian England when Bram Stoker and the original incarnation of Count Dracula exploded into popularity. You see the same thing. Relaxing Victorian morals, rising feminism, represented as a monster drawing women to the dark side.
Wow, yeah, for sure.
And this cultural obsession with the undead fed into the media of the time too. In 1972, Hammer produced the next installment in their seemingly endless line of Dracula movies called Dracula AD 1972. At this point, they just totally run out of titles. And they're just like, it's 1972. That's what we'll call it.
Gotta make that money.
This movie featured actor Christopher Neame in the role of Johnny Alucard, a not-so-subtle backward spelling of the name Dracula. Alucard. Now, Alucard was a London occultist who dressed very similar to David Farrant, going to show you how cyclical this whole feedback loop had become. This served to drive vampires even harder into London's consciousness, blurring the lines between what was real and what was imaginary. And it didn't hurt that grave defilements were popular pastimes for London legend trippers. In fact, if you read just about any reference to the Highgate Vampire, they'll talk about how Tottenham Cemetery was desecrated a few months prior to the riot on Halloween of 1968.
I think we need to find out if Tottenham lost a football game.
Which is actually a really good, how much did that have to factor into?
Yeah.
I didn't think about that, but you have a good point there. Any desecration in London, you got to be like, well, what was the state of football at the time?
Yeah. Come on, you gotta find out.
Hooligans.
Yeah, exactly.
Allegedly, during this incident, a recently interred body was dug up from Tottenham Cemetery. The casket was opened, a ring of flowers surrounded the casket laid out, and a stake was driven through the chest of the corpse. And a lot of sources quote this and say that this was the beginning of the Highgate Vampire. This was the first incident where we see vampiric, or I guess anti-vampiric activity in London in this decade. All of these reports seem to stem from Bill Ellis's 1993 investigation of the Highgate Vampire, which was published in the magazine Folklore. This has been echoed and reprinted again and again, with skeptical writers often pointing to this corpse staking event and Hammer Dracula as the catalyst. Like, this is why the whole thing started.
But these were all reported after the fact?
Yes.
Long after the fact?
Yes.
So do we even know if it happened?
Yeah, something about this didn't sit right with me.
Yeah.
So I did my own digging. And I was able to find a November 2nd, 1968 edition of the Journal, which had an article titled Probe into Black Magic at Cemetery. Okay? The incident allegedly happened on Halloween, so this would be 2 days later. Police in Edmonton, North London, are investigating desecration at the private Tottenham Park Cemetery after a black magic ceremony on Halloween. Police said that 2 coffins in a communal grave were disturbed. The coffins had a thin covering of soil on Thursday. Coffins were smashed open, headstones and crosses were ripped up, and a trail of black magic symbols were found. At the head of a communal grave, a headstone cross was decked with wreaths stolen from the other graves. Some of the flowers were arranged in mystic symbols. That's what the article says. The cemetery foreman, William Dakin, was disturbed by the events and declared them related to what he called a Halloween cult, whatever that means. But he's really focused on the flowers and their arrangement in magical symbols. You know what he never mentions? A stake through the body.
Oh.
In fact, he says, quote, boxes, headstones, vases, and flowers have been disturbed, but no bodies have been touched.
So this could be just your general Halloween night, let's tip some shit over.
Yeah, let's fuck some shit up.
And run around.
Yep.
So no reporting on touching even disturbing the soil, maybe even. Like nothing like that.
No, I mean, the corpses were not touched at all. So clearly, the reports of the staked corpse was a misrepresentation. Probably a mistake by Ellis, possibly conflating the 1968 grave desecration with the 1970 riot that actually did leave a staked corpse in the middle of one of Highgate's paths. But that was after the vampire mythology started. So obviously, something's a little off there. There was a mistake at some point.
Yeah.
So what's the deal with all of these destroyed coffins and desecrations? They're obviously not vampires, but were they acts of occultists carrying out black and white magic rites? Or is there another more credulous explanation? Something we might have talked about already. Do you remember our exploding coffins?
Oh, right. Wow, really? Even then? When they would exsanguinate and like remove shit? Like still?
So the truth, I think, is somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
Remember, so we talked about these exploding coffins. There's gases from the deceased. They would build up over time and blow the caskets apart in above ground mausoleums, right? That's a well-observed effect, even in the 1960s, and one that caretakers could account for. See,
really?
Yeah, they started a practice of what they called burping the coffins, or releasing the gases periodically as the bodies decayed and letting air out.
What a job.
Yeah, you would burp coffins.
You know, I'd rather do that than work in retail again.
Yeah. It's like, you want to like work retail, sell some shit to consumers, or you want to burp coffins? You're like, I'd rather burp coffins.
Burp coffins. Want to work retail around the holidays? That's what's on my mind right now.
Whoa,
I'm like,
yeah, seriously.
give me 50,000 old coffins any day.
Remember, Highgate and the other magnificent 7 cemeteries were broke, run down, and largely forgotten. It's no surprise that the remaining caretakers were overworked and stretched too thin to conduct their usual business, which means that as the cemeteries got more desolate and more creepy, the incidence of exploding coffins also rose. So imagine you're just a legend tripper. You show up to one of these cemeteries late at night. You're just there for kind of an excitement, right? And you creep into one of these mausoleums. Everything's all run down, overgrown, it's super creepy. You creep into a mausoleum, and what do you find but a coffin that's been smashed open from the inside? Imagine where that places you mentally.
I would be terrified if I didn't know.
Right?
And I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know unless you told me. I wouldn't know about this.
Yeah, exactly.
So, question, when they
Yes.
were seeing this stuff happen, was it around like the summer?
This was between seasons. Spring, generally.
Okay. I would imagine that the gases would build more in hot weather, warm weather, or does it not matter?
I honestly don't know if that matters. Any undertakers or cemetery caretakers that are listening to this podcast, Slaying Monsters Podcast. Hey now. Slaying Monsters Podcast at gmail.com. Does the weather, the humidity, the ambient temperature affect the gases that are built up in corpses?
Yes, good question. I really think that it does, personally, with the limited knowledge that I do have about studying this stuff as a fiction writer, not as a murderer.
And then,
I think it does affect it.
But then
somewhat.
it would make sense, wouldn't it? Because David Farrant's initial encounter with the Highgate Vampire, where he just saw the eyes, was in December. But when all of the shit started to go down, the riot, all of that, that was March. So it's getting warmer at that point. We've gotten cold. It's getting warmer. Maybe. Not something I thought about. It's a good point.
Thanks.
Regardless, I think it's no wonder that these vampire rumors started. Between the influence of the media, the push and pull of society, and the fact that you may very well walk into a graveyard and see a coffin that's just broken open from the inside, is it any surprise? In its own way, 1960s London was culturally similar to Victorian London, at least when it came to their proximity to death. The same cultural influences that drove writers like Bram Stoker to craft these tales of undead monsters leaping out of their coffins, seducing innocent maidens, wielding evil powers born from their occult persuasions, they're still here in the 60s. A vampire never walked through Highgate Cemetery, at least not a literal vampire. But an actor playing one did, in the form of Christopher Lee's Dracula. And the obsession with death and black magic, so intrinsic in London's psyche, sowed the seeds of the myth, allowing the story to be believable, even if it's only for a minute. That myth galvanized a pair of would-be vampire hunters and somewhat social outcasts of opposing faiths, and it launched a decades-long feud between them. It drove a nighttime riot that caused some of the most macabre destruction the little community has ever seen. That's the true power of the Highgate Vampire. A monster that didn't even need to exist to hold power and sway over mortal people, to manipulate their minds and inspire chaos and conflict without ever being more than words on a page or stories told late at night in a London pub. And that's the tale of the Highgate Vampire.
Nice. It's interesting how people are, when their minds get stuck in this anachronistic loop, I don't know how much it can influence everybody around them. It just becomes this fever dream of like fantasy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is exactly where Manchester ended up. I mean, it's where Farrant ended up. You know, they believed so strongly in what they thought they were doing. And people followed them. People still do, man. You know? Like, people still swear up and down that Manchester and Farrant, like, did the right thing and were correct and all of that. Yeah. Yeah, they have their own little internet supporter groups.
Cool. I mean, you know, have fun. Enjoy yourself.
Just have fun with it.
Just have fun. It's great. I mean,
it's really wild. I'm very glad that nothing too bad came out of this.
Seems
you know,
like
it's some corpse desecration. It's not great, but like nobody got injured, nobody got hurt, nobody got killed. Which totally could have happened. Like this could very well have escalated to the point of like the Salem witch trials. Oh, that person's a vampire, putting people on trial, attacking people in their homes, you know.
Yeah. It seems like nothing too bad happened. It seemed like, if anything, friendships were made, because that guy who found the skeleton in his car, that could have been his new...
I mean, maybe.
His new buddy.
I don't even know. Man, it must be a hell of a thing to wake up and see a skeleton in your car and... I guess you call the police, but then the police have to figure out where the fucking skeleton came from?
Yeah.
How do you link that back to somewhere else? Like, oh, God.
Well, I guess you can look at the crazy desecrated cemetery down the street and be like, I guess it came from there.
But there were so many missing. Like, imagine how hard it was, first off, to put all of those bodies back where they belonged. And then also... it's not like Highgate was really well run at that point. Whose job was that? That it sucks enough you're already overworked, and then they're like, yeah, well, you got to figure out how to put all these bodies back.
Honestly, listen, when you're dead, you're dead. This is my opinion. I give this up to Manchester now. I say to you and the friends that follow him, I'm like, you know what? I don't care what happens to my body when I'm dead. If they want to go and stake me when I die, if they're still around, I give them full, what is that? Full...
Permission?
Permission, thank you. Full permission. Because who cares? I don't want people to have to spend time worrying about where the body goes back in the hole. Who cares? Like don't worry about it. If it was my body, don't just throw, like just Danny DeVito me, like that, like as he said in It's Always Sunny,
Yeah.
When I'm dead, just throw me in the trash.
Throw me in the trash.
It's kind of how I feel. It's like, who cares? I don't care anymore. So have your fun, like, put me in your LARPing thing, have a good time. I don't care.
I mean, you know this, but I want to be stuffed and put in an action pose.
It's true. That's a lot of work. But see, now you're making people do work for you.
Well, they should want to. They should relish it.
I guess.
It's how they show that they cared for me in life.
All right. Well, Matt's very selfish. And I am just like, do what you want.
There you go. There's our two personalities. But yeah, that's the story of the Highgate Vampire. It's really, it's a lot of fun. I'm really glad that we got the chance to talk about it. I'm glad that it happened so coincidentally around the release of Nosferatu, when we're seeing vampires return to the media. Watch out for this, dude. This could be the start of a whole new Highgate Vampire scenario here.
How exciting.
I guess so. I think we have less to worry about the Highgate Vampire and more to worry about like UFOs.
Yeah, the drones.
Yeah.
What they could be. Maybe they're vampires.
Oh, drone vampires.
Drone vampires.
I feel like there was a movie at some point with vampires on a space station. Or maybe that was just an idea I had. That might have been an idea I had. Well, somebody should make it. If it hasn't been made, somebody should make it. Because the thing is, if you're on a space station, you're not necessarily going to be exposed to the sun.
That's a good point.
Right?
You could shield that if that was the case.
Isn't that cool? It's kind of like a 30 Days of Night on a space station. It's actually, we just watched Alien Romulus.
Oh, yeah.
Which is fantastic. But it's kind of taking Alien Romulus and then doing that with a vampire.
Dude, that's a great idea. That is a great idea.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, or like Train to Busan with vampires.
Oh my God, yeah.
Anyway.
Such a good movie.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're done. I'm sorry. I just want to say one thing. I think, and my conclusion is that after this, Guy Ritchie should do the movie for this.
So you're picking Guy Ritchie over Stephen Merchant now?
No, I think that Guy... Ooh.
Or Taika Waititi. I think Taika Waititi was the other one that you talked about. Guy
Ritchie can work with Stephen Merchant.
Okay.
Taika Waititi's already got his own stuff. He's got his vampire stuff.
He does, yeah. Taika Waititi, he's been there. I wouldn't want him to end up being the Christopher Lee and being like the go-to vampire guy.
Here we go again.
Right,
yep,
exactly.
He'd get bored. He's got to do other stuff.
Precisely. Yeah, actually, Taika Waititi has to move on to what we do in the moonlight so we can get some werewolves, because there were not enough werewolves in what we do in the shadows.
Hell yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much. We will be, this is the end of the year, believe it or not. This is our last episode of 2024.
Whoa.
This is also 2 years that we've been doing this podcast. It's pretty awesome. Yeah, we got a lot of cool stuff coming to you in 2025, so stick around for that. All right, thank you so much for listening. Have a fantastic new year. We'll see you soon.
Happy holidays, everybody. See ya.
Be safe out there.
Next time. You stand frozen on the side of a country road, an impenetrably dark forest ahead of you. In the distance, a chilling howl cuts through the silence, a mournful call signaling the third night of the full moon.
Thanks for listening to Slaying Monsters, the Paranormal History Podcast. If you like the podcast, there's a couple ways to show your support. You can tell your friends, you can leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform, or you can head over to slayingmonsterspodcast.com and click on the Support Us button to leave a donation. For questions, suggestions, and other feedback, reach out to us, slayingmonsterspodcast@gmail.com, and stay up to date by following us on Instagram @slayingmonsterspodcast. Your support helps us grow, and we are truly grateful to have our listeners and community.